June 6, 1944. Just after dawn, high in the Bavarian Alps, inside the Berghof Adolf, Hitler slept beneath heavy curtains drawn tight against the early summer light. The Führer had gone to bed late. The night before, reports had been contradictory. The weather foul, the channel seemingly impassable. His commanders had assured him this was not the invasion, not yet. Outside that quiet mountain retreat, the world was already changing. At 6:30 a.m. in Normandy, Allied soldiers were dying by the thousands. Along a 50-mile stretch of the French coast, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, 156,000 Allied troops were forcing their way ashore under artillery fire, machine gun nests, and concrete fortifications Hitler himself had ordered built. The Atlantic Wall, meant to be impenetrable, was cracking open. Back in Germany, telephones rang unanswered. Inside the German High Command, panic moved faster than authority. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Erwin Rommel, Hitler's most experienced commanders in the West, were not where they were supposed to be. Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. Rundstedt hesitated, bound by orders that required Hitler's personal approval to release the armored reserves. And Hitler was still asleep. Those closest to him stood frozen outside his bedroom door. No one dared wake him without certainty. For years, the German war machine had been shaped around one man's instincts, one man's decisions. Even now, as Allied paratroopers dropped from the skies and naval guns thundered across the channel, the fate of Europe waited on whether Adolf Hitler would open his eyes. When he finally did, the reports laid before him were grim and still incomplete. Landings confirmed, multiple beaches, airborne troops inland. Hitler listened. Then he spoke. His words, delivered with rigid confidence, would echo through the collapsing structure of Nazi command and seal decisions that would shape the next 11 months of war. But in that moment, June 6, 1944, was not yet a victory. It was chaos, hesitation, and a deadly belief that this might still be a diversion. By the time Adolf Hitler was fully briefed, the morning had already slipped away. It was nearly 10 a.m. when the Führer finally authorized the first concrete response. Hours, irretrievable hours, had been lost. Along the beaches of Normandy, that delay was being paid for in blood. In Berlin, the situation maps were a mess of red pins and frantic annotations. Reports flooded in from the west, many of them contradictory. German officers argued over the scale of the landings. Some insisted this was still a feint, a carefully staged deception meant to draw German forces away from the real blow yet to come at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler clung to that belief for months. Allied deception, Operation Fortitude, had worked its way into the German mind. Phantom armies under General George Patton, fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, all of it pointed relentlessly toward Calais. Hitler had believed it then. He believed it now. And belief became paralysis. Despite urgent pleas from Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Hitler refused to release the powerful panzer divisions stationed inland. These armored units, the only force capable of smashing the beachheads before they hardened, remained idle, engines cold, waiting for a command that would not come. In Normandy, German defenders fought desperately. At Omaha Beach, American troops were pinned against the shingle, cut down by machine gun fire from bluffs that had not been fully destroyed by the preliminary bombardment. Some officers believed the landings might yet be thrown back into the sea, but Hitler never saw Omaha. The reports he focused on told him something else, something reassuring. The landings, he was told, were scattered. The Allies were disorganized. Their airborne drops had missed objectives. This, Hitler decided, was not the decisive invasion. Shortly before noon, he issued his assessment. The main Allied attack, Hitler declared, was still coming. Normandy was merely the opening move. With that judgment, the fate of the day tilted further. As Allied engineers cleared beach exits and tanks began rolling ashore, German armored divisions sat immobilized by distance, confusion, and a command structure that revolved around one man's certainty. By early afternoon, the moment to crush the invasion was slipping away. And still, Hitler waited. By mid-afternoon on June 6th, the invasion had passed an invisible threshold. The Allies were no longer clinging to the beaches. They were expanding beyond them. In Normandy, American and British units began pushing inland, linking scattered airborne forces with infantry landing zones. Engineers blasted gaps through hedgerows and seawalls. Supply depots took shape on open sand. What had begun as a desperate gamble was hardening into permanence. Inside the German command structure, the tone had shifted from denial to alarm. Field Marshal von Rundstedt called it plainly. The war in the West is lost. He warned, unless immediate, decisive counterattacks were launched. Erwin Rommel, racing back toward Normandy, sent word that Allied air power had turned the roads into killing zones. German movements by daylight were becoming impossible. These messages reached Hitler's headquarters. He dismissed them. Hitler remained convinced the invasion's true center lay elsewhere. Pas-de-Calais still dominated his thinking. The 15th Army, his strongest force in the West, remained locked in place, guarding a coastline the Allies would never come for. Finally, under mounting pressure, Hitler released 2 panzer divisions. It was too little and far too late. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend and Panzerlehr began moving toward Normandy, but Allied aircraft turned every bridge, every crossroads, every column into a target. Tanks were abandoned. Fuel trucks burned. What should have been a crushing armored blow dissolved into scattered arrivals. On the beaches, Allied soldiers could feel the change. German fire slackened. Resistance remained fierce, but no decisive counterstroke came. The Atlantic Wall, designed to shatter an invasion in its first hours, had failed to do its one essential task. By evening, more than 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. That night, Adolf Hitler addressed his inner circle. He did not speak of failure. He spoke of endurance. He told them the Allies had revealed their hand too early. He said Germany would contain the landings, bleed the invaders, and then destroy them once the real invasion appeared. It was a declaration rooted not in reality, but in faith. As darkness fell over Normandy, Allied forces dug in, consolidating positions that would soon become the largest battlefield in Europe. And for the first time since 1940, Nazi Germany faced a Western front it could not simply wish away. As June 6 gave way to night, the sounds of war did not fade, they multiplied. Across the Normandy coast, Allied ships continued unloading men, tanks, ammunition and fuel under the cover of darkness. The beaches, once killing grounds, became lifelines. Wounded soldiers were carried back to waiting vessels while fresh. Units stepped forward into the hedgerows of France. For the German army, the night brought no relief. Erwin Rommel reached his headquarters late, exhausted and furious. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The invasion was real. The beaches had not been sealed. The Allies were in force, and their air dominance made daylight movements suicidal. Rommel sent urgent messages to Berlin. The panzer reserves must be released immediately. Every hour mattered now. Hitler was unmoved. In his headquarters, maps still showed Pas-de-Calais circled in red. Intelligence officers spoke cautiously, aware that challenging Hitler's convictions carried consequences. The Führer insisted the Normandy landings were a prelude, a costly distraction meant to draw German strength away from the true objective. So the 15th Army remained frozen in place. Along the front, German soldiers paid the price of that decision. Isolated units fought without coordination, launching local counterattacks that collapsed under naval, gunfire and Allied artillery. Without massed armor, there was no way to drive the invaders back into the sea. By midnight, the reality was undeniable to everyone, except the man at the top. The Allies had a foothold. In London, Winston Churchill stayed awake, receiving updates from the beaches. Losses were heavy, especially at Omaha, but the line had held. The invasion had survived its most vulnerable hours. In Germany, Adolf Hitler finally conceded one point. This was not a raid, yet even now he refused to believe it was the invasion. Before dawn, he issued orders to prepare for a second, larger Allied assault, still expected at Pas-de-Calais. Divisions that could have struck Normandy remained tied down, guarding shadows and ghosts. As June 7th approached, the window to destroy the beachheads slammed shut. And with it, Germany's last realistic chance to stop the Allied return to Western Europe. June 7, 1944. The second day of the invasion revealed what the first had only hinted at. The Allies were not leaving. Morning light exposed the scale of what had come ashore. Tanks stood wheel to wheel on the sand. Artillery batteries were already firing inland. Long columns of men moved steadily off the beaches, disappearing into the maze of Norman hedgerows. Temporary harbors were taking shape where open sea had been the day before. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied the overnight reports in silence. The language had changed. No longer were commanders speaking in conditional terms. They spoke of breakthroughs, of linking sectors, of lost villages. The Atlantic Wall, once described as a fortress, had become a series of isolated strongpoints, being bypassed or destroyed. Still, Hitler resisted the central conclusion. He ordered reinforcements to Normandy, but cautiously, incrementally. The bulk of his armored strength remained north, guarding Pas-de-Calais. The logic was unchanged. If Germany committed too much too soon, the Allies would strike elsewhere. This decision fractured German command. Rundstedt and Rommel were now aligned in urgency. They demanded freedom of action, authority to maneuver, to strike fast, to concentrate armor where the enemy actually stood. Hitler refused. He alone would decide where and when Germany's strength would be used. The result was a war fought in fragments. German units reached the front piecemeal, exhausted from night marches and air attacks. Some arrived without fuel, others without infantry support. Against them stood Allied forces growing stronger by the hour, supplied by the largest naval armada in history. On June 7th, Allied aircraft flew nearly 14,000 sorties. German movement was visible, predictable, and lethal. Hitler's frustration grew. He raged against his generals, accusing them of defeatism, of lacking faith. He reminded them that Germany had survived crises before, that miracles had happened in 1918, that resolve, not realism, would decide this battle. But the battlefield did not respond to rhetoric. By evening, Allied beachheads had merged in places. Supply lines were secure. The invasion was no longer vulnerable, it was entrenched. For the first time since the war began, Adolf Hitler faced a truth he could not erase. The enemy was inside Fortress Europe, and removing them would require sacrifices Germany could no longer afford. By June 8th, the illusion of control was gone. Normandy was no longer a temporary crisis. It was a widening wound. Allied forces pressed outward from the beaches, capturing towns whose names would soon be etched into history. Carentan, Bayeux, Saint-Mère-Église. The hedgerows became killing fields, but they also became corridors of advance. Every village taken made the beachheads deeper, stronger, and harder to uproot. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's mood darkened. He paced, shouted, dictated orders at a furious pace. His commands grew increasingly disconnected from the reality on the ground. Divisions were ordered to counterattack immediately, without fuel, without air cover, sometimes without maps that reflected the new front lines. Generals who hesitated were accused of cowardice. The German High Command now spoke in private, not meetings. They understood what Hitler would not say aloud. The chance to crush the invasion in its infancy had passed. The war in the West had entered a phase. Germany was structurally unprepared to fight. On June 9th, Hitler finally allowed limited authority to local commanders. It was a symbolic concession, and it came too late. Rommel attempted to assemble a coordinated defense, but Allied air power ruled the skies from dawn to dusk. German tanks moved only at night, creeping forward under darkness, then hiding beneath trees by day. Supplies arrived in fragments, if at all. Meanwhile, Allied confidence surged. The Mulberry harbors, vast artificial ports, were nearing operational status. Within days, they would allow thousands of tons of supplies to flow ashore daily. What Hitler had hoped to contain was becoming a self-sustaining invasion machine. Still, Hitler refused to abandon Pas-de-Calais. The 15th Army remained in place, watching an empty horizon. The deception had worked perfectly, and it continued to shape Hitler's decisions long after its purpose was fulfilled. By June 9th, the question was no longer whether the Allies would be driven back into the sea. The question was how far they would go and how much Germany would lose trying to stop them. Hitler would soon answer that question in the only way he knew how, by demanding total resistance regardless of cost. By June 10th, Normandy had become a crucible. Allied troops were moving beyond the initial beaches, linking sectors and securing inland routes. Paratroopers, who had landed behind enemy lines days earlier, had held vital crossroads, preventing German reinforcements from arriving on time. Engineers worked feverishly, constructing bridges under fire, turning rivers and streams into highways for tanks and artillery. In Germany, Adolf Hitler sat in the Führerhauptquartier, obsessing over maps, reports, and telegrams. He refused to consider the mounting evidence that the invasion was not a diversion but the main blow. Every time a report arrived of advancing Allied forces, he blamed misjudgment or overreaction by his commanders. Rommel, back from the front, pleaded again for freedom to maneuver, for armored counterattacks to be unleashed without waiting for Berlin's approval. His arguments were logical, desperate, rooted in months of experience observing Hitler's strategic blind spots. But Hitler would not budge. Pas-de-Calais remained the true target in his mind, and the divisions stationed there, the cream of Germany's armored strength, were still frozen. Meanwhile, German soldiers on the front suffered increasingly chaotic conditions. Communication lines were destroyed by Allied bombing. Supplies were intermittent. Orders changed constantly. Some units moved forward only to be told to fall back, leaving men trapped in hedgerows under relentless artillery and airstrikes. On June 11th, the Allies secured Carentan, linking Omaha and Utah beaches. This small but critical victory gave them a continuous front and allowed armored units to move inland. Every mile gained increased the psychological pressure on German troops already stretched thin. The beaches were no longer the fragile foothold of June 6th. They were the backbone of the liberation of Western Europe. Hitler's anger grew with each passing hour. His generals, trapped between obedience and survival, could only obey or face severe consequences. Yet even as they followed orders, they knew the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The Allies were no longer vulnerable invaders. They were now a determined, organized force, and Germany's failure to act decisively in those first hours would echo across the rest of the war. The die had been cast, and the consequences would be catastrophic. By June 12th, Normandy had transformed into a sprawling battlefield. The Allies were no longer simply defending beachheads, they were pushing into the heart of France. British and Canadian forces captured Caen, fighting house to house, hedgerow to hedgerow, while American divisions pressed toward the Cotentin Peninsula. Roads once empty now echoed with the constant roar of artillery, trucks, and tanks. Paratroopers, once scattered and isolated, linked up with advancing infantry, solidifying a front that Germany could no longer hope to roll back. Back in Berlin, Hitler's obsession with Pas-de-Calais continued to dictate strategy. He demanded reports on phantom forces that did not exist and ordered units that might have halted the Allies to remain frozen, guarding the wrong coastline. Every report of Allied success was met with fury, disbelief, and accusations of incompetence. Rommel, increasingly desperate, bypassed protocol. He attempted small-scale counterattacks where he could, assembling armored units at night under cover of darkness, only to be repelled by superior Allied air power and artillery. Supplies could not reach him fast enough. Reinforcements were slow, and every attempt to regain the initiative was met with frustration, not just from the enemy, but from Berlin itself. On June 13th, the Allied supply network was fully operational. Mulberry harbors were delivering thousands of tons of men and material daily. Field hospitals treated the wounded as rapidly as possible, while engineers repaired the damage caused by relentless German counterattacks. Allied coordination was evolving from a desperate gamble into a precise, unstoppable operation. Hitler, increasingly isolated, refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. The invasion, he insisted, was still a feint, a prelude to the real strike at Calais. His generals could only watch as the Allied beachheads strengthened, knowing that the failure to release panzer divisions in those first critical hours had irreversibly changed the course of the war. By mid-June, the seeds of Germany's collapse in the West were fully sown. The Allies were no longer a threat to be contained. They were a force that would soon sweep across France, unchallenged at the operational level, while Hitler's obsession with the wrong target ensured that Germany would fight the rest of the war on the defensive. By June 14th, the Normandy front had become a relentless grind. Allied troops moved steadily inland, securing villages, crossroads, and bridges. Engineers repaired roads cratered by Luftwaffe attacks, allowing tanks and artillery to reach the front. The logistical network the Allies had painstakingly constructed, supplies, reinforcements, medical aid, kept the momentum alive. Every advance, every captured village, made the German defensive lines more fragmented, more vulnerable. In Berlin, Hitler's obsession with the Pas-de-Calais Phantom Army remained unshaken. He issued increasingly impossible orders. Counterattacks at points that no longer existed. Defenses where no troops could be spared. He insisted that Normandy was a diversion, refusing to release the bulk of his armored reserves. His generals, including Rommel and Rundstedt, watched their command authority erode, knowing that precious time and resources were being wasted. Rommel had moved to coordinate what counterattacks he could, but Allied air supremacy made even minor maneuvers lethal. Tanks were strafed on open roads. Columns were ambushed from the air. German troops fought bravely but in piecemeal, isolated engagements, unable to deliver the concentrated blow needed to throw the Allies back into the sea. On June 15, the Allies captured Bayeux and pressed on toward the interior. Every mile inland shifted the psychological weight of the campaign. Soldiers who had faced relentless bombardment now faced a determined force, capable of supplying itself faster than the Germans could react. The Normandy beachheads were no longer temporary footholds. They were the foundation of liberation. Hitler, increasingly enraged, lashed out at generals, accusing them of incompetence and cowardice. Orders were issued, counter-orders issued, confusion multiplied. Meanwhile, the Allies advanced with surgical precision, exploiting every German error and delay. By mid-June, the die was clear. Normandy was no longer a battle to contain. It was the beginning of the end for Germany's Western Front. Every hesitation, every misjudgment, every refusal to act decisively had placed Hitler on a collision course with disaster. By June 16th, the Normandy campaign had entered a new, perilous phase for Germany. Allied forces were consolidating their gains and expanding their reach. British troops pushed toward Caen from the east, while American divisions moved through the hedgerows toward Saint-Lô and the Cotentin Peninsula. Paratroopers, having disrupted German communications and reinforcements in the early hours, now linked up with the advancing infantry, ensuring that supply lines and lines of communication remained intact. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's stubborn fixation on Pas-de-Calais continued to paralyze German strategy. He refused to authorize a decisive concentration of panzer divisions in Normandy. Instead, units capable of striking the Allies remained frozen, guarding phantom threats, while piecemeal counterattacks were ordered with impossible speed and precision requirements. Rommel, increasingly desperate, attempted to coordinate what he could on the front. Night movements allowed some armored units to reach contested areas, but Allied air supremacy ensured that every attempt was met with destruction. Convoys were strafed, bridges bombed, and units left stranded. German soldiers fought with courage, but without coordination or support. Heroism alone could not stem the tide. By June 17, the Allies had secured Carentan and pressed toward Cherbourg, the key port on the Cotentin Peninsula. Each captured town, each repaired road, strengthened the invasion's logistical backbone. What had started as a risky gamble on June 6th had now evolved into a self-sustaining, unstoppable push. Hitler's disbelief and rage intensified. Reports arrived daily of successful Allied advances. Casualty figures mounted, yet his focus remained elsewhere. Pas-de-Calais continued to dominate his strategic vision, leaving Normandy largely undefended from a central, coordinated counterstrike. For the German command, the reality was undeniable. The window to destroy the Allied invasion had closed. The battle for Normandy was no longer a fleeting crisis. It was a protracted struggle that Germany could only hope to delay, not win. By June 18th, the Normandy battlefield had transformed into a sprawling, chaotic theater of war. Allied troops were no longer confined to the beaches. They moved inland with purpose. Towns like Carentan, Saint-Mère-Église, and Bayeux were firmly in Allied hands, and engineers were busy repairing roads and bridges to keep the advance fluid. Tanks and artillery rolled steadily behind infantry lines, supported by aircraft that dominated the skies and kept German reinforcements pinned. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's obsession with Pas-de-Calais continued to dictate strategy. He believed the Allied landings at Normandy were a feint, a distraction from the real attack further north. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest western force, remained largely inactive, guarding a coast that the Allies would never target. Rommel, increasingly desperate, tried to coordinate German counterattacks with what forces he had. Panzer divisions moved at night, often without fuel or infantry support, attempting to strike Allied positions. But the Allied air forces attacked relentlessly, strafing roads and supply convoys, leaving the German units scattered and vulnerable. By June 19th, the Allies had secured a continuous front along the beaches, connecting Omaha with Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Their foothold was no longer fragile. It was operational. Supplies, reinforcements, and medical aid flowed steadily from the Mulberry harbors, ensuring that the momentum could not easily be halted. Hitler, isolated and infuriated, issued harsh commands. Generals who hesitated faced his wrath, yet even his fury could not change reality. The invasion had grown beyond his control. The beachheads were secure, the Allies were advancing, and Germany's chance to repel them in those critical first hours had vanished. By nightfall on June 19th, the Germans faced a grim truth. Normandy was no longer a crisis to be contained. It was the beginning of a permanent front on the western side of Europe, one Germany was ill-prepared to fight. By June 20th, Normandy had shifted from a contested coastline to a sprawling, entrenched battlefield. Allied forces were pushing deeper inland. American divisions advanced through hedgerows, capturing villages one by one, while British and Canadian units pressed toward Caen. Engineers repaired roads, cleared mines, and built bridges under constant threat from German artillery and sniper fire. The logistical backbone of the invasion, the Mulberry harbors, supply ships, and convoys, kept the offensive moving at a pace Germany could not match. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's stubborn obsession with Pas-de-Calais continued to dictate strategic decisions. He refused to grant full autonomy to commanders in Normandy, insisting that any counterattack must be carefully coordinated, even as precious hours slipped away. Panzer divisions remained immobilized, waiting for orders that never arrived in time to strike decisively. Rommel, increasingly frustrated and aware of the mounting losses, tried to work around the chain of command. He orchestrated nighttime counterattacks, attempting to disrupt Allied supply lines and slow the advance. But Allied air superiority and accurate intelligence meant every movement was observed, and every attempt met with devastating artillery or aerial bombardment. German forces were exhausted, fragmented, and under constant pressure. By June 21st, the Allies had captured key positions that threatened to cut off German forces in the west. The beachheads were secure, supplies were flowing freely, and forward positions allowed for armored units to engage effectively. What had begun as a risky, ambitious operation on June 6 had transformed into a firmly established foothold in Western Europe. Hitler, increasingly enraged, raged at his generals for ineptitude and cowardice, yet even his fury could not reverse the tide. The moment to crush the Allies in their first hours had passed, and Germany's strategic paralysis ensured that Normandy would remain a dangerous and expanding front. By the end of June 21st, the reality was undeniable. The Allies were not just in France, they were firmly established, and Germany had no immediate way to eject them. By June 22nd, The Normandy campaign had evolved into a relentless contest of attrition. Allied forces had expanded their beachheads into a network of fortified positions. Roads and supply lines, infantry, tanks, and artillery moved deeper into France, linking with airborne units that had secured critical crossroads days earlier. Every advance, every captured village, strengthened the foothold and brought the Allies closer to the interior of Normandy. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's obsession with Pas-de-Calais remained unbroken. He refused to divert the bulk of Germany's armored reserves, still believing the Normandy landings were a diversion. Orders were issued piecemeal, counterattacks were scattered, and German forces faced the Allies in fragmented, isolated pockets. Rommel, increasingly desperate, attempted to coordinate attacks under the cover of night. German tanks moved through the hedgerows, only to be met with overwhelming Allied firepower and constant air attacks. Supply shortages, destroyed roads, and exhausted troops made every counterattack costly and largely ineffective. On June 23rd, the Allies secured vital positions that allowed for further inland expansion. Engineers repaired bridges and cleared obstacles while artillery and air support suppressed German positions. The beachheads were no longer temporary. Footholds, they had become operational. Bases capable of sustaining a prolonged advance. Hitler, isolated and infuriated, issued strict orders demanding that every possible effort be made to contain the Allies. But the delay in mobilizing armored units had left Germany on the defensive. The Allies were no longer vulnerable invaders. They were a well-supplied, coordinated force entrenched in the heart of Normandy. By the end of June 23rd, the die had been cast. The Normandy invasion was irreversible, and Germany's Western Front had entered a phase from which it would struggle to recover. By June 24th, the Normandy front had become a sprawling, entrenched battlefield that Germany could no longer hope to contain. Allied forces were consolidating and expanding. American units pushed towards St. Lo, while British and Canadian divisions advanced on Caen. Engineers repaired roads, constructed bridges, and cleared fields of mines, ensuring that tanks and artillery could move freely. The Mulberry harbors were operating at full capacity, funneling men, weapons, and supplies directly into the advancing forces. Every day, the Allies grew stronger and more coordinated. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler remained fixated on Pas-de-Calais. His refusal to commit armored reserves to Normandy left the German front fragmented and vulnerable. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and Rommel continued to push for decisive action, but Hitler's paranoia and rigid belief in a diversionary strike elsewhere paralyzed any chance of a coordinated counteroffensive. Rommel tried desperately to maneuver what limited panzer divisions he could toward threatened sectors. Night movements allowed some temporary gains, but Allied air dominance and artillery fire destroyed convoys, isolated units, and prevented meaningful impact. German forces were exhausted, low on fuel and ammunition, and increasingly demoralized. By June 25th, the Allies had captured critical crossroads and linked beach sectors, creating a continuous front. Their beachheads, once precarious, were now firmly established and capable of sustaining a prolonged push inland. The momentum, once fragile, had shifted decisively. Hitler, enraged, lashed out at his generals, demanding results from an impossible situation. Yet even his fury could not change reality. The Allies were entrenched, supplied and advancing. The critical hours to repel them had been lost, and the campaign in Normandy had entered a phase that would test Germany's capacity to respond and ultimately expose the weaknesses in Hitler's command. By June 26th, Normandy was no longer a beachhead. It was the beginning of the Allied liberation of Western Europe. Allied forces had linked the 5 beaches into a continuous front. Tanks, artillery, and infantry moved inland with methodical precision, supported by a constant flow of supplies from the Mulberry harbors. Engineers repaired roads, bridges, and rail lines. turning once difficult terrain into arteries for the advancing armies. Paratroopers secured vital crossroads and disrupted German communications, ensuring that reinforcements could not arrive in time to change the outcome. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the latest reports. The words on the page must have seemed impossible. Normandy was firmly held. The Allies were advancing, and German forces had suffered heavy casualties. Yet Hitler's mind remained consumed by Pas-de-Calais. He refused to commit the majority of Germany's strongest divisions, convinced the true invasion lay elsewhere. His generals, increasingly frustrated, could only follow orders, knowing that every hesitation in those first hours had sealed the fate of the Western Front. Rommel and Rundstedt watched in disbelief as the Allies strengthened their positions. Nighttime armored movements could not compensate for the delay in decisive action. German soldiers, exhausted, low on supplies, and isolated in hedgerows and villages, were unable to reverse the momentum. By the end of June 26, the stark reality was clear. The invasion could not be rolled back. The 156,000 men who had stormed Normandy's beaches on June 6 were now entrenched, resupplied, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. The dream of crushing the invasion in its infancy was gone, leaving Germany on the defensive for the remainder of the war in Western Europe. And in the Berghof, Hitler sat isolated, furious and in denial, convinced the real invasion was yet to come. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the ground and the world beyond knew that the tide had irrevocably turned. The D-Day landings had succeeded. The Allies were ashore, and the course of history had changed forever.